In the spring of 1887, along the frost-cracked banks of Montana's Judith River, the settlers of Silver Creek watched a widow do something that defied every rule of frontier common sense. Her name was Hannah Braddock, and instead of mending the sagging roof of her cabin or splitting cordwood for the coming season, she was planting sunflower seeds. Not in a garden plot behind the house, not along the fence for travelers to admire. She was pressing them directly against the outer walls of her cabin, so close that a man could scarcely have slipped his boot between the seed and the timber. The line of buried seeds followed the foundation logs like a thin, dark thread, tracing north, then east, then south, then west, until the entire structure sat inside a narrow ring of freshly turned soil. Her 12-year-old son, Micah, walked a few paces behind her carrying a small tin bucket of seeds and a wooden dibber worn smooth from years of use. Beside the woodshed, a gray-muzzled shepherd dog named Bramble lay half asleep in the pale morning sun, one ear lifted whenever the wind shifted. There was no hurry in Hannah's movements. She placed each seed with the same slow precision a seamstress might use to set a stitch, tamping the soil, moving one careful step, and beginning again. By the end of the first week, the cabin stood inside a completed ring, and the strangeness of the sight was no longer possible to ignore. In frontier country, every hour of warm weather carried a price. Fields waited to be plowed. Fences needed setting before the range cattle drifted through. Cellar doors needed patching, hinges needed oil, and firewood needed stacking taller than a grown man before the first hard freeze. Time spent on decoration was time stolen from survival. So when word began drifting across the valley that the widow Braddock was ringing her cabin with flower seeds, the town assumed she had lost her sense. The rancher who owned the neighboring quarter section, a lean and weather-cured man named Josiah Renner, was the first to ride close enough to ask about it. He drew his horse up along the split-rail fence and rested his forearm on the pommel, watching her work for a long minute before speaking. He asked her, gently enough, what the flowers were for. Hannah pressed another seed into the earth, brushed the dirt over it with 2 fingers, and answered without looking up. She said only that they were for the cabin. Nothing more, no reason, no explanation. Josiah waited a moment longer, glanced at the wall, glanced at the seed line, and finally turned his horse back toward his own land, with the uneasy feeling of a man who had received an answer that explained less than the question ever had. That same evening, the story reached the general store at Silver Creek Crossing, and by the next morning, it had traveled to the sawmill, the smithy, and the little whitewashed church on the ridge. Men who had never spoken more than a word to Hannah Braddock suddenly held strong opinions about what she was doing. Cornelius Hatch, who ran the credit book at the store and controlled most of the winter supply accounts in the valley, called it a waste of good daylight. Silas Vaughn, a carpenter who had raised barns and cabins from Bozeman to the Dakotas, laughed openly when he heard about it. Flowers, he told the men at the mill, did not stop winter. Nothing stopped winter. You built thicker walls, you cut more wood, or you froze. That was the whole of it. The nickname arrived quickly, the way nicknames always did in small valleys. By the end of the month, folks were calling the place the Sunflower Widow's Cabin, and the name was already sticking to Hannah herself. She heard it. Everyone did. Silver Creek was too small a town for a whisper not to reach the person it concerned, yet Hannah offered no defense, corrected no one, and answered no questions. The seeds kept going into the ground, and the silence around them only made the mystery grow taller. The talk about the Sunflower Widow's Cabin carried through the whole of June, but very little changed on the Braddock homestead itself. Inside the cabin, life moved with the same quiet rhythm it had kept for 3 long years. A man's canvas work coat still hung on the peg behind the door, its collar darkened by years of sweat and sun. A short-handled splitting axe rested against the stone hearth, exactly where it had leaned the last morning Ezra Braddock had lifted it. Neither object had been moved since the day he failed to return from a cattle drive gone wrong in a spring storm on the Missouri breaks. His body had never been recovered. Only his horse had come home, saddle empty, reins broken, mud caked, halfway up its flanks. Some evenings, when the light in the cabin turned the color of steeped tea, Bramble would rise from his place by the door and pad slowly to the empty rocking chair beside the hearth. He would circle it once, then settle underneath, as though waiting for a familiar boot to press down on the floorboards nearby. Hannah never chased him away. Neither did Micah. The dog knew something about waiting that neither of them had the heart to disturb. One night, while the last light drained from the sky beyond the low western hills, Micah stood at the front window and watched the pale green shoots of the first sunflowers pushing up along the north wall. He asked his mother, without turning around, whether his father would have liked what she was doing. The question hung in the room like wood smoke. Hannah did not answer at once. Her hands continued working a length of hemp cord around a splintered fence rail she had brought in for repair. When she finally looked up, her eyes drifted to the far wall of the cabin, past the coat, past the axe, to something Micah could not see. The answer never came. Outside, the young stalks kept reaching upward toward the long summer light. Inside, some preparations for winter carried a weight that had nothing to do with warmth alone. The idea had not started in Montana. It had not even started with Hannah. Years earlier, when she was still a young bride newly married into the Braddock family, Ezra's grandmother had come to stay with them for a season. The old woman had been born in a Volga German settlement far to the east, where families raised in the shadow of long Russian winters had carried certain habits across the ocean and out to the American plains. She had spoken little English, and what she did speak carried the soft, rounded accent of a place Hannah had never seen. But her hands had never stopped moving, and neither had her lessons. The old grandmother treated sunflowers differently than most Americans did. Yes, she gathered the seeds for oil and for eating, the way any farm wife would. But the plant itself, she taught, was valuable long after the yellow petals had fallen away. Dried stalks were bundled and stacked around root cellars to keep the potatoes from freezing. Smokehouses were wrapped the same way. In the hardest winters, even the small stone sheds where the milking goats slept received a layer of dry stems tied against the outer walls. She had shown Hannah how to bundle them, how to weave the heads into the gaps, how to secure them so the wind could not tear them loose. She had not called it a technique. She had simply called it the way things were done. One phrase from those long afternoons had stayed lodged in Hannah's memory ever since. The old woman had said it while pressing a bundle of stalks tight against the side of a hen coop, her wrinkled fingers working the cord without needing to look. "The cold hunts walls," she had said, in her careful, halting English. "Give it something else to find first." At the time, standing in the mild green summer of Missouri farm country, Hannah had heard it as folklore, the kind of saying old women repeat because their own grandmothers had repeated it. Now, standing beside a Montana cabin with a Montana winter, waiting somewhere beyond the Big Belt Mountains, she understood what the old woman had been describing all along. It was not superstition. It was a system, and it had already outlived more winters than most people in Silver Creek would ever see. By the middle of August, the young sunflowers around the Braddock cabin had shot up faster than most in the valley believed possible. The soil along the foundation had been worked deep, and Hannah had watered the ring by hand every dry morning, carrying 2 wooden buckets from the creek before the sun had cleared the ridge. The stalks were already chest-high on Micah, and the first heavy buds were beginning to turn their faces toward the eastern light. Every wagon that passed on the road slowed as it went by. Some drivers stared openly. Others pretended to check a harness strap while stealing a longer look. Even the children coming home from the little schoolhouse at Silver Creek Crossing began taking the long way, just to walk past the strange yellow fence rising up around the widow's home. Then the wind arrived. It came down out of the western passes one afternoon with the sudden violence that Montana country was famous for. The sky had been clear at noon. By 3 o'clock, a dark bruise of cloud had swallowed the ridgeline, and by 4, the gusts were tearing across the flats hard enough to lift dust in long brown ribbons. Loose shingles rattled on the barn roof. A wooden bucket rolled across the yard and lodged against the corner of the woodshed. Down near the creek, a section of split-rail fencing collapsed with a dry, cracking sound. Bramble ran 3 tight circles around the porch and then pressed himself flat against the door, whining low in his throat. When the gusts finally eased near dusk, nearly a third of the western row of sunflowers lay flattened across the ground. Broken stalks stretched over the dirt like green spears snapped at the shaft. Leaves had been torn loose and scattered halfway to the barn. The damage was plainly visible from the road, and by the following morning, half the valley had heard about it. Silas Vaughn, the carpenter, happened to ride past just after sunrise. He drew his horse to a stop, studied the flattened row for a long moment, and shook his head slowly beneath the brim of his hat. He did not need to say anything. His posture said it for him. He had warned the men at the mill this would happen, and now it had. He clicked his tongue, turned his horse, and rode on with the satisfied silence of a man whose predictions had been confirmed. The news spread almost faster than the storm itself. Some folks assumed the whole strange experiment had reached its natural end. Others predicted the remaining plants would follow with the next hard blow. A few of the older women at the church even shook their heads with pity, as though the collapse of the row somehow proved that the widow had never truly recovered from her husband's death. The next morning offered a different sight entirely. Hannah was outside before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. She wore an old canvas apron over her work dress and carried a small hatchet, a bundle of fresh cord, and a handful of stakes she had cut from willow along the creek. One by one, she began lifting the fallen stalks. Some of the plants could still be saved. She straightened those and drove new stakes deep into the soil beside them, binding the stems with careful cross loops of cord. The ones snapped past saving she pulled up and set aside, and by mid-morning Micah was walking new seedlings up from the small nursery bed his mother had planted behind the woodshed as a reserve. She had prepared for this. She had known. The work stretched across 3 days. Additional cord was strung between the rows so that they could share the pressure when the wind came again. Bramble spent much of that time circling the base of the plants, nudging away the 2 curious ewes from Josiah Renner's flock that had wandered through a broken fence, and once chasing off a jackrabbit that had come too close to a young stalk. By the end of the week, the western row stood again. It was not identical to what had been there before. In several ways, it was stronger. The stakes were deeper. The cord was tighter. The rows were now bound to each other. Silas noticed. So did Josiah. Neither man mentioned it. But the first serious test had revealed something important about the widow's strange plan. It could bend. It could take damage. And it could be rebuilt without being abandoned. The collapse of the western row had given Silas Vaughn the opening he had been waiting for since the first seeds went into the ground. A few days after the repairs were finished, he stopped his wagon at the Braddock property on his way home from a job at the Renner place. Hannah was working along the north wall, tightening cord around a young stalk that had leaned during the night. Silas set the brake on his wagon, climbed down slowly, and walked over to the fence with the deliberate patience of a man who intended to give a lesson. He was not a cruel man. That mattered. Silas Vaughn had raised more than 30 cabins between the Yellowstone and the Missouri, and a handful of them had survived winters harsh enough to become stories the old-timers repeated at the store. When he spoke about wood and weather, men listened, because his opinions had been paid for in cold nights and long labor. He rested a boot on the lowest rail of the fence and looked over the growing wall of sunflowers with the pained expression of a craftsman watching someone ruin a good piece of pine. He told her plainly that she was creating problems for herself. Hannah continued winding cord around the stalk, but she did not interrupt him. Silas gestured toward the plants pressed close against the logs. Those things, he said, would hold moisture against the walls. And moisture, he went on, was the beginning of every rot he had ever cut out of a good timber. Water soaked into the outer face. The outer face swelled. The chinking loosened. The rot crept inward. By the 3rd or 4th spring, she would be looking at a lower course that needed replacing, and that was work she could not do alone. His eyes moved lower, down toward the base of the wall where the seed heads would eventually droop and the leaves would gather. And then, he added, would come the mice. They always came. Give them enough cover, enough dry material heaped against a wall, and they would move in before the first snow. Once they were in the walls, they would find the pantry. Once they were in the pantry, she would be feeding half the rodent population of Silver Creek through the whole of winter. The argument was reasonable because it was reasonable. Every man within 50 miles knew what damp wood eventually did. Every family in the valley had fought mice at one time or another. Nothing Silas said came from arrogance. It came from 30 years of splitting rotten sill logs out of cabins that had looked sound from the road. Josiah Renner, who had ridden over quietly to bring back a borrowed hay fork, happened to overhear most of the conversation from the yard, and he found himself nodding along with nearly every word. Silas stepped a little closer to the wall and rested his palm against one of the exposed logs above the sunflower line. Wood, he said, needed to breathe. That was the whole trick of a good cabin. You built it tight enough to hold the heat and loose enough to let the moisture out. What she was doing, in his professional view, was smothering the very timbers that kept her family alive. For the first time since he had begun speaking, Hannah paused. She lowered the length of cord and looked at the row of tall stalks she had spent the whole of the summer growing. Then she turned her gaze slowly to the cabin itself. Tracing the line of the logs from the foundation up to the eaves, a soft breeze moved through the leaves above her, rustling the broad green faces of the sunflowers. Somewhere behind the house, Bramble barked once at a magpie that had settled on the well cover. Silas waited. He was a patient man, and he expected an answer of some kind, either a defense or a concession. What he received instead was the sight of Hannah bending back to her work, threading the cord through the next tie and tightening it with a small practiced twist of her wrist. The conversation had ended, though he had not felt it end. He stood there for another long moment, looking from the wall to the widow to the untouched cord in her hands. Then he touched the brim of his hat, said nothing more, and walked slowly back to his wagon. The silence, he decided as he climbed onto the bench and gathered the reins, was not confidence. It was stubbornness. And by the time he rode away, he was more certain than ever that winter would eventually settle the argument for him. September came into the Judith Valley with a change so gradual that most folks did not notice it until the mornings began carrying frost. The heavy summer light thinned. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a pale, watery yellow. The tall sunflowers around the Braddock cabin, which had blazed gold through August, began lowering their heads under the weight of ripening seeds. Their broad green leaves stiffened and curled. The stems that had swayed all summer now stood rigid, hardening from the base upward as though the plants themselves were bracing for what was coming. For Hannah Braddock, the true work was only beginning. She harvested part of the seed heads first, the largest and most fully developed ones. Cutting them free with a small curved knife and laying them face up on drying racks she and Micah had built behind the woodshed. Those seeds would feed the family through the winter and provide the following spring's planting. But most of the heads she left attached. Every stalk still standing had a second purpose, and that purpose was about to be revealed. The bundling began on a cold Tuesday morning in the last week of September. Hannah cut the first row of stalks at the base with her hatchet, gathered them into thick sheaves, and bound each sheaf with 3 tight loops of hemp cord. Then she carried the bundles to the north wall of the cabin, one at a time, and pressed them upright against the logs. Micah followed with additional cord, tying each bundle to iron nails Hannah had driven into the upper courses of the wall the previous evening. The thickest stems formed the inner layer, closest to the timbers. Smaller stalks were fitted into the outer gaps. The broad, drooping seed heads were woven into open spaces the way a mason might set stones into an uneven wall, filling voids that would otherwise let wind pass through. The work went slowly at first. By the end of the first day, only a portion of the north wall had been covered. But the pattern of it, once established, allowed the following days to move faster. Micah proved an unexpectedly steady worker. He climbed the short ladder to reach the higher sections, held bundles in place while his mother tied them, and carried armloads of cut stalks from the growing pile behind the barn. Bramble followed the work wherever it moved, settling at whichever corner of the cabin they happened to be working on, and once nipping sharply at a stray heifer that came too close to the harvested stalks. By the first week of October, the north wall had almost disappeared beneath a dense, layered covering of stalks, leaves, seed fibers, and the countless small pockets of trapped air packed between them. Then a problem appeared. One morning, Micah crouched near the base of the western section and called quietly to his mother. There was movement inside the outer layer. Small, quick, familiar mice. A few had already begun nesting inside the loose fibers near the ground, exactly as Silas Vaughn had predicted they would. The discovery would have been enough to confirm every warning the carpenter had made. Hannah did not flinch. She knelt down beside her son, pulled a section of the bundling apart with her hands, and exposed the small hollow the rodents had already begun to shape. Several hours of careful work vanished in a single afternoon. She stripped back the affected portion of the wall down to the logs and cleared out the nesting material entirely. But the next morning, she rode out with Micah to a rocky patch of scrub above the creek and returned with the wagon bed heaped high with bundles of dry sagebrush, wild peppermint, and a coarse bunch of prairie sweetgrass. All three plants carried strong scents that mice and pack rats disliked, and all three had been used by the Plains tribes for the same purpose for longer than any settler could remember. She packed the fragrant material into every vulnerable spot along the newly repaired section, layering it thickest near the foundation where rodents preferred to travel. Then she rebuilt the sunflower bundling over it, tighter than before. Within days, the signs of new nesting became difficult to find. Within a week, they had disappeared altogether. The repair had cost time. It had cost labor. It had also improved the system. And by the last week of October, the walls of the cabin no longer looked like walls at all. They looked like something the summer itself had grown, then wrapped protectively around the home before falling asleep for the winter. Not long after the wrapping was complete, a new object appeared inside the Braddock cabin. Something that struck the few visitors who saw it as stranger than the wall of dead flowers outside. On the wall opposite the cast-iron stove, in a spot where the direct heat could not reach it, Hannah had hung a small brass case thermometer. Beside it, on a shelf worn smooth by years of daily use, sat a slim leather-bound ledger with a stub of pencil tied to its cover by a length of twine. Every morning and every evening, Hannah added a new entry. The temperature outside. The temperature inside. The wind direction, when it could be judged. How much wood had been consumed in the stove since the last entry? How many times, if any, the fire had needed tending during the night? The columns were narrow and cramped, written in the plain block hand she had learned in a Missouri schoolhouse 30 years earlier. But the numbers themselves grew steadily longer as the weeks went on. To anyone watching, the practice looked pointless. Most families in Silver Creek did not measure winter. They simply endured it, the way their fathers and grandfathers had endured it, with heavy coats, stacked wood, and a stubborn refusal to complain about anything that could not be changed. Cornelius Hatch, who stopped by the property in early November to discuss a small credit account Hannah kept at the store, spotted the ledger open on the kitchen table when he stepped inside. He picked it up without asking, thumbed through a few pages with an amused expression, and then set it back down with a laugh. He told her, in the same tone he used for jokes at the store counter, that she could write numbers in a book all winter long, but the numbers were not going to change the weather. A few of the men who had come with him grinned at that. Hannah simply refilled his tin cup from the coffee pot on the stove, wrote another entry in the ledger, and closed it gently. The visitors left soon after, still chuckling to themselves as they climbed back onto their wagons. But out beyond the cabin, out beyond the ridge and the frozen edges of the creek, the valley itself was beginning to issue its own quiet warnings, and those warnings were harder to laugh at. The oldest man in Silver Creek was a lean and weather-worn cattleman named Jeremiah Voss. He had come into the Judith country in the 1860s, well before the town itself existed, and he had spent more of his life reading the sky than reading any book. He rarely spoke about weather unless someone asked him directly. But that autumn, folks who ran into him at the general store or the church noticed a change. He was watching the northern horizon far more than he was watching his own herds. He was standing outside his cabin at dawn and at dusk, with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes turned toward the Little Belt Mountains. And when he did speak, what he said made men uneasy. The signs, he told anyone who would listen, were arriving wrong. The ice on the shallow ponds had formed almost 2 weeks earlier than it should have. The snow on the higher peaks had settled in September and had not lifted once, when in most years a warm October wind would have cleared the ridges at least twice by now. The elk had come down out of the high country nearly a full month ahead of their normal migration, and they had come down in numbers he had not seen in 20 years. The last of the geese had passed over the valley the previous week, flying in tight, hurried formations, and after they had gone, he said, the sky had a certain empty quality that he had only seen twice before in his life. Both times, the winters that followed had killed men. That kind of talk did not carry well at the store or at the sawmill, where most conversations were about lumber prices and cattle. But the men who overheard Jeremiah Voss went home a little quieter than they had come. And out at the Braddock place, Bramble had begun a new habit of his own. Each evening, as the light thinned, the old shepherd scratched at the door until Hannah let him inside, where he settled near the entrance and lifted his head from time to time to listen toward the north wall. November came into the valley with a sharpness that could be felt before it could be measured. The grass along the road turned the color of old straw. Thin sheets of ice lingered in the shaded hollows long after sunrise, and by mid-morning the puddles in the wagon ruts had turned to milky white glass. Every morning seemed to arrive a little colder than the one before it, and the light itself had taken on the pale, thin quality that Montana country wore only in the weeks before real winter. Around the Braddock cabin, the sunflower shell was very nearly complete. Only small adjustments remained. Most people, at that point, would have considered the work finished. Hannah did not. She walked the perimeter of the cabin twice each day, once in the morning and once at dusk, running her hand along the outer layer of stalks and feeling for weak places the way a rider might feel a horse's tendons for early swelling. One evening in the second week of November, a hard wind rolled down out of the northern slopes and swept through the basin for several hours. It was not a storm, only a foretaste of one, but the gusts were sustained and steady, the kind that hunted small mistakes. The cabin held. The bindings held. Nothing appeared damaged when Hannah walked the walls the following morning. And yet, all through that windy night, Bramble had behaved strangely. The old shepherd had refused to settle. He had risen from his place by the stove several times, walked a slow, deliberate circuit of the cabin, and returned each time to the same spot along the interior of the north wall. There he had lowered his nose almost to the floorboards and sniffed carefully, his ears flat, his tail unmoving. Then he had lifted his head, whined once, and moved on. He had done this at least 5 times before Hannah finally set down her mending and watched him carefully. The next morning, before Micah had risen, she went outside with a lantern in one hand and a thin willow rod in the other. The north wall, seen in the pale light, looked exactly as it had when she had finished it. The bundles sat flush against the logs. The bindings were tight. The seed heads were still woven neatly into their gaps. She walked the length of the wall slowly, tapping the willow rod against different sections, listening to the sound each part made. Most of the wall answered with a dull packed thud. Then she reached a section about 6 feet from the northwest corner, and the rod made a slightly different sound. Hollow, faint, but unmistakable. She set the lantern down in the frozen grass and reached both hands into the outer layer. She pulled a bundle aside, then another. And there, hidden behind the outer stalks and completely invisible from any distance, was a narrow void running along the wall. Almost 2 feet long and perhaps 4 inches deep. A channel where the packing had settled during the windy night, leaving a hollow space between the sunflower shell and the logs beneath. From the road, from the yard, from anywhere a person might have stood, the wall looked perfect. But that hidden channel was exactly the kind of flaw that killed a cabin in a blizzard. Moving air, once it found such a space, would gather speed inside it instead of losing it. The wind would push through the outer layer, race along the hollow, and strike the logs directly, cold and concentrated. The rest of the wall could be flawless, and it would not matter. Cold, like water, found the weak place first. Hannah stared at the section for a long moment. Then she began taking it apart. Hours of finished work came down in the pale November light. Bundles were untied. Cord was cut loose. The willow rod was set aside, and her hands worked steadily through the cold morning, rebuilding the section from the logs outward with tighter packing and a heavier layer of dried sweetgrass tucked into the base to close the settling. By late afternoon, the repair was complete. Micah came out with a wool scarf wrapped around his neck and studied the finished section with a critical eye. He told his mother plainly that it looked exactly the same as before. Hannah tightened one last length of cord, stepped back, and looked at the wall for a moment as though listening to something far beyond the valley. Then she answered him quietly. "The wind," she said, "would know the difference." Micah frowned and looked at the wall again. Nothing appeared changed. But some of the most important repairs on the frontier were the ones nobody could see until the weather itself arrived to inspect them. By the third week of November, the work was finished. What stood on the Braddock property no longer looked much like a cabin at all. The sunflower shell surrounded the structure from the foundation logs all the way up to the eaves, and in most places the layer measured close to 3 feet thick. It had been packed firmly enough to hold together through the coming weather, yet loosely enough to preserve the countless small pockets of trapped air that were the true purpose of the whole strange project. That detail mattered more than any other, and it was the detail almost nobody in the valley understood. Hannah had not been trying to build a solid wall. A solid wall would have been useless. Dense material carried cold straight through itself, the way a stone hearth carried heat. What she had built instead was a maze. Every stalk, every dried leaf, every seed head created a small barrier that broke up moving air. Between those barriers lay thousands of tiny still spaces, and it was those spaces, not the plants themselves, that were going to do the work. Cold wind, when it struck the outer layer, would be forced to lose its speed inside that maze long before it ever reached the logs beneath. Seen from the road, the original walls of the cabin had almost disappeared. Only the stone chimney remained fully visible, rising up out of the top of the strange mound like a marker in a snowbank. A narrow doorway broke the outline on the south side. A few small window openings could still be found behind the woven bundles, protected by shutters Hannah had built up around them, so the sunflower shell would not press against the glass. Everything else looked like a great gray-brown hillock that had grown up out of the yard. Silas Vaughn rode past one afternoon on his way back from the sawmill and slowed his horse until it was walking at barely a step. He studied the finished structure for a long time from the road, and then he shook his head slowly beneath the brim of his hat. Nothing about it looked sensible to him. Nothing about it looked, in his professional estimation, like a building that would still be standing in April. A few days later, Cornelius Hatch got his first proper look at the finished project. He was riding back from a debt collection call farther up the valley, and he reined in his horse at the edge of the Braddock property to stare. Then he laughed loud enough that 2 men on horses passing the other direction turned to look. He told them, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that the widow had finally gone and turned her cabin into the biggest haystack in Montana. The remark drew laughter from the men on the road and, within a day, from most of the men at the store. The joke spread fast. New nicknames were tried. Some of them were cruel. Most of them were simply amused, the way a small town is amused by anything it does not understand. Meanwhile, Hannah stood beside the north wall, tightening one final length of cord. The sound of the laughter never quite reached the yard, but the shape of it did. She had heard enough of the store gossip through Micah, who was old enough now to sit quietly near a group of men and pick up more than the men realized. Neither of them reacted. The last bindings were secured one at a time, checked, and secured again. When the work ended at last, on a cold gray afternoon in the final week of November, the cabin possessed something that most people passing on the road could not recognize even when they were staring straight at it. They saw dead plants. They saw wasted daylight. They saw a widow who had lost her judgment along with her husband. What actually stood before them was something else entirely. It was a second wall. It was a barrier that had grown up from the summer soil, been shaped by hand across 4 months of steady labor, and been rebuilt at least 3 times when weather or vermin exposed a weakness. It stood between the family inside and everything that was coming toward them from the north. The wind arrived that night for the first time, with real weight behind it, sliding down out of the passes with a low, steady moan that carried across the valley for hours. Inside the cabin, Bramble lifted his head, listened, and lowered it again. Hannah opened her ledger, wrote the date, and recorded the first temperature of what she suspected would be the deciding week. Winter was no longer approaching. It had crossed the ridge. The morning of December 14th, 1887, began deceptively still. The sky was a pale, flat gray, and the air had that heavy, waiting quality that old cattlemen had learned to distrust. Jeremiah Voss rode into Silver Creek Crossing shortly after breakfast, tied his horse outside the general store, and stood on the wooden boardwalk for a long time, with his hands in his coat pockets, staring north. When Cornelius Hatch called out to him from the doorway with some cheerful remark about the weather holding, Jeremiah did not answer. He mounted his horse, turned it back toward his own homestead, and rode away at a pace that made 2 men on the boardwalk stop talking mid-sentence. By noon, the temperature had dropped 19 degrees. By 2 in the afternoon, it had dropped another 16. Cold air poured down out of the Little Belt Mountains and into the Judith Basin with the weight of a river breaking a dam, forcing everything before it into a frantic retreat. Ranch hands ran cattle toward the shelter of the coulees. Wives called children in from the yards. Wagons vanished from the roads. Doors were barred. Windows were shuttered a final time. Then, the wind arrived. Within an hour of its first gust, it was blowing steadily at close to 60 miles an hour, with stronger gusts pushing well past 70. The snow did not fall from the sky. It raced sideways across the flats in long white sheets that erased the world in front of a man's face. Fence lines disappeared first, then the barns, then whole homesteads. By late afternoon, the Judith Valley looked as though someone had drawn a wet cloth across it and wiped it clean. Visibility in some places dropped to less than the length of an arm. 2 ranch hands from a spread near the river later admitted they had spent almost 20 minutes crawling along the ground on their hands and knees, following a coil of rope just to get from the barn back to the kitchen door. The storm did not weaken. That was the thing that later would haunt the men who lived through it. Blizzards were expected. Blizzards were survived. What arrived over the Judith Basin that night was something else. It kept building. Hour after hour, the wind held its pressure without a single lull. Timbers cracked. A livestock shed at the Renner place lost its door in the first evening. A section of roofing peeled away from the smithy in town, somewhere out past the ridge. A stand of old cottonwood snapped near the base and came down in the darkness. The sound of the wind against the valley became something no one who heard it ever forgot. Old men compared it, later, to the low, steady roar of a freight train that never passed by. Inside the cabins throughout the basin, conversations grew shorter. People fed their stoves. They checked their walls. They watched their windows disappear behind driven snow. They waited. At the Renner homestead, the wind found gaps that Josiah had not known were there. Cold air pushed through a crack beneath the front door that had not troubled him in 12 years of winters. It slipped past chinking that had shrunk during the dry summer. It found a narrow separation between a window frame and the log wall behind it. Each gap alone was nothing. Together they became a steady, invisible invasion. Frost began forming along the inside of the north wall by the second hour of full dark. By midnight, patches of white ice had spread across the logs nearest the corner. The stove burned without a break. It did not matter. The thermometer inside the Renner cabin refused to climb higher than 42 degrees. Josiah fed more wood into the firebox. His wife wrapped their youngest daughter in 3 woolen blankets, and the child still shivered beneath them. Every hour or so, Josiah counted what remained of the wood stacked inside the door. and every hour the pile looked smaller than he wanted it to. 300 yards away across a rise of frozen prairie, another cabin stood in the same wind, under the same snow, on the same night. And inside that cabin, the experience was so different that it might have been happening in another season entirely. The roar of the blizzard still surrounded the Braddock place, but it arrived softened, muffled, its sharp edges stripped away, the way a shout sounds through a heavy wool coat. Bramble slept beside the stove with one ear folded over his face. Micah sat at the kitchen table reading by lamplight. The thermometer on the wall opposite the stove held steady at 63 degrees. Sometime after midnight, while most of the valley fought a losing battle against the cold, Hannah opened the cabin door just long enough to look at the north wall. The wind attacked her immediately, driving snow past the doorway in a horizontal white blur. And she held the door with both hands to keep it from being torn from its hinges. But the wall itself, seen in the swinging lantern light, stood exactly where she had left it. A thick crust of packed snow had built up across the outer face of the sunflower shell. Ice had locked the loose fibers together. Wind-driven crystals had filled the small gaps between the bundles. The structure no longer looked like a collection of dead plants. It looked like part of the landscape, like a low frozen ridge rising up out of the yard. And beneath that ridge, invisible to any eye, the maze was doing its work. The blizzard was striking the outer layer with the full force of the mountains behind it, but instead of reaching the cabin as a single concentrated blow, the wind was being torn apart. Thousands of stalks, leaves, seed heads, and pockets of trapped air disrupted its movement. Large currents broke into small ones. Small ones collided and scattered. By the time the air reached the logs beneath, it no longer carried the strength that had crossed the ridge. Hannah pulled the door closed, latched it, and returned to the ledger on the table. She wrote the time. She wrote the temperature. 63 degrees inside. Outside, so far as she could measure through the small shielded window she had left clear for that purpose, 41 degrees below zero. The blizzard finally released its grip on the Judith Valley during the morning of December 16th, 2 full days after it had begun. The silence that followed was the strange, ringing silence that comes after a long noise ends. Josiah Renner spent nearly an hour digging his front door free of the drift packed against it. When he finally stepped outside, the snow stood higher than his shoulder in places, and his fence lines had disappeared entirely. Inside his cabin, 3 new cracks had opened in the chinking along the north wall, and his wood pile was almost gone. During the worst hours of the storm, his thermometer had briefly fallen to 38 degrees. After he had seen to his livestock, Josiah found himself walking the frozen road toward the Braddock place. Part of him expected to find wreckage. When the cabin came into view, he stopped in the road. The structure was still wrapped. The outer surface of the shell had suffered damage, entire patches of stalks stripped away by the wind, sections near the top flattened. Loose fibers hanging frozen beneath layers of ice. But the core remained intact. The dense inner layer still hugged the logs. What had been torn away had done its job in being torn away. A thin ribbon of wood smoke drifted from the chimney into the pale winter sky, not the heavy, desperate smoke of a stove fighting for its family's life. Just enough. He knocked. When Hannah opened the door, warm air rolled out over him. Inside, Micah sat at the kitchen table eating porridge. Bramble did not lift his head from his place by the stove. Josiah looked at the thermometer, then at the wood stacked neatly along the wall, then at the ledger open on the table. Hannah, without a word, turned it toward him. He read down the columns through the 2 days of the storm. His own family had burned nearly twice the wood and been more than 20 degrees colder throughout. The numbers required no interpretation. He closed the book, walked to the north wall, and rested his palm against the logs. They felt warm, not heated. Steady, he lowered his hand slowly and looked at Hannah. He said only that he had been wrong. It was enough. Spring returned to the Judith Valley the way it always did, slowly, in patches. When planting season arrived, the first sunflower seeds Josiah Renner pressed into the earth went along the walls of his own cabin. Two more families followed him that year, five the year after. Silas Vaughn never quite admitted his warnings had been misplaced, but he began studying the bindings with a craftsman's eye and eventually developed variations of his own. Cornelius Hatch simply stopped telling the joke. Over the years, the nickname changed. The Sunflower Widow's Cabin quietly became the Flower Wall, and then, in time, just the way things were done in Silver Creek. Some kinds of wisdom on the frontier arrived loudly, in arguments and warnings and men shaking their heads on horseback. Others arrived quietly, disguised as something ordinary, sometimes even as something foolish, a ring of seeds, a pocket of still air. A grandmother's phrase carried across an ocean and half a continent. The cold hunts walls. Give it something else to find first. Winter would come again, as winter always did. And by then, more of the walls in the valley had learned to be ready for it. If this story reached you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who loves frontier tales, and leave a comment about the strongest quiet person you have ever known. Subscribe for more stories from the American frontier, where the smallest choices sometimes made the difference between surviving the season and being remembered by it. Peace.